Welcome. My name is Kutumi Castro, and I would like to present to you a social justice view on counseling. Before we begin, I would like to invite you to take a moment of silence to honor our connection and impact, followed by the gong. Decolonizing Counseling. Why? Counseling derives from privileged views. The founder figures of counseling were white cisgender male, and the research population samples have predominantly been white cisgender individuals as well. You can appreciate a fraction of the most well-known counseling figures in these pictures, like Jung, Maslow, Watson, and Sigmund Freud, among others. Due to this fact, counseling was developed from a Eurocentric ideology and a universal view with the belief that counseling fits everyone. Counseling testing and diagnostic tools have been developed under the same principle. The roots of counseling lack diversity, and most counseling models are white patriarchal, and so they don't accurately represent multicultural populations. Why do we want to decolonize counseling? Because it promotes oppression on people with non-dominant identities. It is culturally insensitive. It also leads to misdiagnosis. It exposes vulnerable populations to receive micro and direct aggressions. It is a form of indoctrination of white or whitewashing. Many cultural clients cannot rely on white counseling, and so they discontinue therapy. Or if they decide to pursue counseling, they will resort to code switching. In the book, The Globalization of the American Psyche, Ethan Waters says, the idea that people from different cultures might have fundamentally different psychological reactions to a traumatic event is hard for Americans to grasp. He writes that during the tsunami of 2004, many trauma experts from the US, Britain, France, Australia, and New Zealand arrived to Sri Lanka. The assumption that trauma reactions exist outside and unaffected by culture was a common belief among trauma counselors. Over time, therapists were frustrated and their interventions ineffective. Western counseling had missed the simple but impactful cultural belief of karma and how this shapes the way Sri Lankers process tragic events. They also miss the multiple resources this population has utilized in previous crises, such as their own healing modalities, community, religion rituals, and so forth. Marcia Warren Edelman states that code switching is the dynamic way that multicultural individuals change their perception and behaviors to respond to different cultural situations, and is used to adapt and survive. In other words, multicultural individuals will literally hide and protect part of themselves, consciously or unconsciously, in the presence of a possible aggressor, which in the case of therapy, the aggressor may be a counselor that lacks multicultural competency. Lance Smith notes in her book, Querying Multicultural Competency in Counseling, that microaggressions are often the vehicle by which the most sensitive and pluralistic of counselors and psychologists unknowingly and unintentionally marginalize and oppress clients with non-dominant identities. I am a Latinx mestizo born and raised in Ecuador. I hold Indigenous American and Spanish heritage from both of my mestizo parents. My mother is from Colombia and my father is from Ecuador. I was born in a mid-upper socioeconomical class. I am a transgender and pansexual person who most often passes as cisgender male. I was privileged enough to start receiving therapy during my adolescence and continue participating in therapy groups and individual counseling for most of my life. The biggest challenges I have encountered during therapy are the following. First, reclaiming my Indigenous identity and embracing who I am. The practices of my Indigenous heritage are stigmatized in the West as drugs and psychedelics, and our connection to spirit or spirits as delusion. Over time, I learned not to speak about this, as many of my therapists have vented their insulting bias at me, making me feel inadequate. Second, I lost much of my Indigenous identity due to colonization. So most of my journey of self-empowering and self-actualization has been about grieving and regaining my cultural identity. Now, most of the therapy I have participated in has had Western views with spiritual tendencies. The problem with this is that most of the therapists and teachers had always made an effort to make me go beyond my identities into the dissolution of ego, a dangerous process for myself, since I did not even know what I needed to dissolve. How do you dissolve something you don't even know? How do you transcend the unknown? Many of their views and interventions spiritually bypassed my experience and created an added layer to work through that was not mine. I remember one time one of my therapists in Italy asked me if I was involved in cocaine dealing. He could not understand how I had money to be in Europe and pay for expensive therapy seminars. He assumed this because I had roots in Colombia, he said. He was a white German cisgender male therapist. Another incident I don't seem to forget is when a female white therapist and a teacher who I dearly love said, I like African music, I could be black. After I tried to trace a series of microaggressions and I had received from her. In the same conversation, she laughed and mocked the gender identity movement. You could imagine how that impacted me as a non-conforming gender person. How? How do we want to decolonize counseling? Through through a social justice counseling lens. The following are some suggested guidelines that I have learned from my clinical counseling program at Naropa University, my clinical internship site, Safe House Progressive Alliance for Nonviolence, and my experience as a person of color with multiple marginalized identities while navigating and learning therapy for over 2 decades. First and foremost, as a counselor has to do their own good work of understanding their social location and impact. As you can see on this graphic, there are multiple locations that you may or may not be privileged or marginalized locations. Some examples are race, gender, age, income, religion, and so on. Next, we want to be aware and understand dynamics of power and privilege between the client and counselors, such marginalized client and marginalized counselor, privileged client and privileged counselor, privileged client and marginalized counselor, privileged counselor and marginalized client. In addition, we need to recognize intersectionality in ourselves and our clients, and do our best to navigate mindfully and aware of these locations in the therapeutic relationship. What is intersectionality? It refers to the way that one person may hold privileges while also holding marginalized identities. These identities could be visible or invisible and played out in different areas of our private or social lives. Always work with the 4 I's of oppression or systemic view. The 4 I's of oppression are ideology, internalized, interpersonal, and institutional. These four These four realms are inseparable and play out in every social interaction, whether we see it or not, and influence the way our locations interact with each other. Normative ideologies are institutionalized, and so the institutional, the interpersonal, and the internalized reality of a marginalized person differs tremendously from a privileged person. In a large sense, privileged therapists do not have to deal with the institutional and ideology realm. And so most of the counseling interventions stay in the intrapersonal and interpersonal realm and fail to address larger systems and their impact. To address this in clinical interventions, the therapist must identify the social, political, economical, cultural, and history factors that affect the client's issue, and also recognize signs indicating that a client's behavior and concerns reflect the response to systemic or internalized oppression. Also, we would like to use a client-centered approach. This is a client-directed intervention where the therapist witnesses the presenting issue, follows the client's lead, and co-creates a resolution with the client, always remembering that the client knows better about their own lives. This intervention should be trauma-informed as well as strength-focused and needs to be inclusive of cultural and historic factors. Why strength-focused? Because every traumatic incident comes with resilience, and that needs to be unpacked, resourced, and validated to help your client create new healthy narratives. With this approach, you can keep track of your bias and countertransference while reading verbal and nonverbal cues of the impact of the intervention. Remember that understanding intention versus impact is essential when working with clients. If you have good intentions, but your intervention microaggress your client, you can promote a repairing process by showing curiosity, listening, acknowledging, and apologizing. Words matter and have an impact. It is essential to use culturally sensitive language, such appropriate pronouns, and also be aware of the words that reinforce superiority and invalidates the experience of your clients. For instance, when talking about my culture, I have heard Western therapists use words like the revival or renaissance of indigenous cultures. This wording reinforces Western superiority by acknowledging only Western culture, since indigenous culture has been fully alive in their context and have never had to be revived. In other words, the revival is in the dominant culture only. It also reinforces the power to decide when indigenous cultures are revived and included in the dominant culture, centralizing Western authority. Last but not least, advocacy. A therapist needs to distinguish those problems that could be resolved through social political action and seek out and join with potential allies. Work with other organizations to have a referral system and be willing to find social resources to support their clients. In this way, build a community network that supports diversity. Resist and decolonize at all costs. I am of the belief that capitalism has created delusion that we can thrive alone. But behind the veil of illusion, there is a network of people who are supporting us or holding us back. We need to see this network and make it work for every human and heal our relations. As a counselors, we have the potential and privilege to do so. To end our time together, I would like to invite you to take a moment of silence and gratitude. Thank you.